afternoon. Hope you're good. Hope you can hear me. Let me know. Usual paranoia over tech. And I'm sorry I'm a few minutes late. I know you'll be fuming. I know you all, naturally every day waiting by your computer or devices for me to go live, of course. Many thousands of you. And so, yeah, sorry I'm late. My little twins, those that follow along on social media, know them as Test and Control. They went to nursery for the first time today for a little taster session. So I was waving them off. That was quite the moment. Completely anticlimactic. No big dramas from them or from anyone else, including us, really. I think we were all right about it, but I just wanted to be there for that. And so it means I was stuck in traffic getting back here. Hope you're all good. Hope you had a nice weekend. There's been something that's been on the to-do list to talk about, as well as what's been recommended to talk about for a few reasons, which is what I want to go to today, which is sort of professional and intra-professional identities. And it's not as much about the sort of what it means to be our various MSK professionals. I think most people know my take on that. But instead, I've been asked to unpack my thoughts on the utility as well as the sort of practicality of sort of these intra-professional titles and where that matters. And so whilst we're talking sometimes about physios and osteos and sports therapists and massage, soft tissue therapists, whatever, there's also then within those disciplines, you've got, of course, things like manual therapist or hands-on therapist, or be that a Pilates-based therapist or a movement specialist, or whatever it might be. And those are more delineated titles that I think matter sometimes and don't in others. And so I want to go there because of a few people requesting such. Alistair said he's absolutely livid about my timekeeping, but he's got me loud and clear. Yeah, I thought he might be. That's exactly the sort of person that's just going to be fuming. Alistair, famously impatient person, so of course I jest. But yeah, thanks, Ali. I'm glad you can hear me all right. So yeah, my question that I want to throw to you before I sort of riff on this and then get your comments on it is, what do you identify as professionally? Be that by professional title, and is there anything when discussing something with, let's say there's a professional stranger, in a sense that you've got someone that you're encountering in a professional context, be that lobby of a conference or something like that, or you bump into them and it just so happens that you tend to be in the same field, and they start talking about something, say, professionally. Is there anything that you use as shorthand for what you're into? So do you describe yourself as a manual therapist? Do you describe yourself as a sort of exercise therapist? Do are there any other features like that? Do you describe yourself by historic qualifications, like a what's it called, Mackenzie therapist or whatever? Whatever your background, and if so, why? Because I think sometimes, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this, is because some of the questions coming in were even weighted in a favor of saying, why is it that you feel that it matters, and why are you against those sorts of labels? And I was like, am I against them? Am I bothered? Am I bothered enough to be against them? And what is my position? It sort of challenged me to that. And then also it's relevant for me to reflect on why I might be perceived to be, at least by these few people that might have asked that question in that way. And I think that one of the things that came up is that because I'm sort of fairly often say that I'm not bothered what certificates on your wall. It's this notion that fundamentally I want someone the most qualified, especially MSK professional, to see patients, and that I would look at the geography, and sometimes people will ask me who do you send someone to if they come to you in, and then insert name of town or whatever. And then it tends to be that I just instinctively don't give a monkeys as to what their qualifications are. I just care about the quality of their care and their therapy and stuff. So I use that term therapist, MSK therapist, and therefore that's probably a title. And so then you think about, well, why? What is it there? What that delineates different categories? How's that distinct from orthopedics? How's it distinct from pain? And so, yeah, I realize that this is something that can be quite fertile ground for discussion, but it's not necessarily confined to professional titles, of which I think we've discussed either on this show or people have heard me talk about before. But then it seems that my opinion on that has been sort of suggested that I'm a lumper rather than a splitter, in that I don't see there being utility to people that might want to identify according to a modality of which that they practice with most. So people, acupuncture based, or manual therapy based, or exercise therapy based, or I'm really into strapping, or I'm K-tape specialist or whatever. You see all sorts of different things, sometimes for marketing reasons, but also because that's people feel strongly about that modality, that style of care, not always just down to one modality. But yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are on that, and when it's sort of relevant to be definitely differentiated as a specialist, but also how it matters. Massive thanks to those that are commenting already. I promise you I will be I will definitely be getting to those, and as those that tune in usually know, I will be utterly distracted by them as they roll, not necessarily spit out my take on the matter. So I'll be back to you. So thank you so much for them coming in, and I'll get back to those. But I'm just going to close off the comments for a second, just to make sure I spit out my point, because as I say, it's kind of based on questions that had come in, and also what I think is completely accidental, and I understand how it's happened, but I do think it's a bit of a misrepresentation of my views. And that's that I completely understand why people would naturally want to, as a means of professional shorthand, which I've kind of hinted at before, as to why people might then try and accelerate a conversation by explaining that this is a shorthand for my style of practice. And that might be, whatever you typically would do, be that for treatment modalities, or even a wider heuristic of how you go about things. And also, I noticed Ollie Thompson's in the comments, and thank you for joining, Ollie. He's someone that I've been speaking about with this on a fairly regular basis, about what it is that define someone. Could even be under a biopsychosocial model. I'm a quite psychosocial therapist, or what have you. And I think that that's something that's relevant. And I think that the devil's in the detail as to why people are doing it. And I think that that's what matters most. Is that, and I'm going to go quite past that sort of professional title thing and go intra, because I think it maps onto other things there. But when someone is wanting to they might have 2 minutes with someone and they're just trying to make sure that they clarify their views, then you can sort of get a few steps ahead. Instead of going down to who you treat, you might want to just lean into giving someone an example of, I'm quite exercise based, or I'm quite hands on, or something like that. And it gives a shorthand for the fact that I feel like that gives the most bang for the buck. That's where I hang my hat in terms of what I do with or to people. And I think that in certain circumstances, certain contexts, I can completely understand why people do it. Now, where I particularly dislike it and disagree with it is because I'm someone that naturally, call it contrarian, often accused of that, but just generally speaking, I'm looking for the chinks in armors, and including my own, and sometimes nitpicking, and people feel like I'm trying to identify areas in which we could, that's fertile ground for discussion. One of the things that I think really spoils conversation, especially at a time where this is young work, young science, it's something that generally speaking is all up in the air, really. There's no foundations have been shaken over, especially the last decade. Means that if people identify so strongly within a modality or a style or a course or a legacy qualification of sorts within their discipline, then if they identify so strongly with that it becomes attached to their character, it becomes something that it's so a part of what they are. We know that people do that with professions, and we know that beyond medicine and healthcare is like people identify strongly with some specific things that are a vocation and their profession. And what do you do is a very typical social question for various reasons. But if someone strongly identifies by being a manual therapist, or I'm Maitland based, or I'm a McKenzie therapist, or I'm particularly into movement dysfunction, or I'm a Pilates, not necessarily even calling himself a Pilates instructor, again, that could be qualification-based, but a Pilates-based movement therapist, I heard recently. that doesn't inherently bother me, and I can understand the shorthand as to why they're doing that. But if they identify so strongly with that it becomes so central to their character, and this is the kicker, is that if they, on challenge of that modality, not of them as a person, but on challenge of that modality, or some questioning, typically me questioning, say, the mechanism of effect, or I'm not against that, but typically I don't think that should be central to care. I might find myself saying, some of the, particularly something like acupuncture or particular taping interventions, like, I can sort of comprehend times and places for these things, but it's unlikely to be so central to my care that I would then suggest that would be ever really integral to my identity. And that's why I tend to be someone that's sort of bigger picture, and I describe myself under the typical model of care, MSK, and the patients that I see or what have you. And so this is the bit that gets sticky, is that unfortunately sometimes when people hear me challenge a modality or challenge the underlying premises and foundations and priors and things like that people base it on, they then, if they've attached that theme, that thing, that technique, or even that treatment heuristic, or even that model of care, if you think about biomedical, biopsychosocial, holistic, or whatever these titles are, whatever it might be, if they've so attached to that, then it actually becomes something that's quite central to their sense of character. And it can't, and I've made this mistake many a time, they can't help but then, it seems, some great people, great thinkers, great friends of mine, that then can't help but be personally wounded or offended by that in such a way that it's really difficult to have a decent conversation about it, and to openly, objectively even challenge that, is because they don't no longer think you're playing the ball and not the man, right? They see it as being a clumsy challenge in which you've taken all of it, because they are so identified with that thing that typically then they feel like they're under a personal slight from you question. You've some of their foundations, and that is what's challenging. It's not a perfect, you don't get me, but sometimes, and I've learned this, is that if you've got someone that's attaching something like a sense of character and the sense of self, and it's what they're known for, and their friends and family, etc. I noticed my connections just dropped right down. Apologies. Do apologize if you're getting a bit of a glitch there. It looks like it's sorted itself out, but anyway, just as I was getting into eventually finishing my point, it's then you want to tread more carefully. Basically, it doesn't mean that they're in the right necessarily, and I think that sometimes I try to point this out and say, look, I'm questioning the thing, not you. You just happen to really like said thing, and so we need to try and take the pace of it and calm things down, because I'm certainly not personalizing it. You are. However, what I'm coming to realize, I've come to realize, as I said, the hard way, is that you do want to toe the line a little more carefully, because in general sense, in a sort of social decorum, cultural conversation type circumstances, that you would naturally find yourself being more careful if you were trying to question, if you were someone that wanted to question the utility of something like a religion with a very religious person. You would naturally go, or you'd be smart to go about things in such a way that you would creep up to that, or reflect on, well, I personally am not into that because I don't think this, or I don't believe this, or I'm not someone who has faith in that. And I think typically, especially a caring professional, would be, if you wanted to have that conversation, you'd be naturally gentle, because you recognize that those beliefs aren't external beliefs or thoughts that aren't attached to someone's sense of self, sense of character, sense of belonging, and other things. It's kind of known that that's coded within their character. And that, unfortunately, whilst an imperfect analogy, is sometimes what can happen, particularly over time, within these intra-professional identities, and the styles of practice or modalities and things. I think that becomes so central to their character that then, at the very least, you need to be just more careful, more gentle in creeping up to that. It doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't be questioned. I think that that's something that, people know me would know that that's certainly something that I'd be most concerned about, anything that's off the table. If I'm most constantly wanting to put the cards back on the table, but admittedly, for the sake of practical utility, then when you notice that of others, then I think it's something to creep up on. And I would say that that is a thing. Intra-professional identities, I'd say, is more potent than, say, the professional ones. You know, it's like I certainly would say, I doubt it, I'm a fairly thick skin, but if I saw someone sort of really going to town on the biopsychosocial model, even without it being misrepresented, they're just sort of really bashing it for some reason. I'd find that to be more objectionable. I doubt I'd buy it, really. I doubt it would wound me, but I'm just giving an example. I'd find that to be something that would be more objectionable and more likely to receive pushback from me than if someone was to be bashing physiotherapy. Even though technically physiotherapist is what I sign a professional register to identify with, in terms of it being a protected professional title, of which is very true to my identity in many ways. But it's something that would just be so unlike, because what they might be railing against there is this. 5 years ago, they saw a stroke physiotherapist for their dad's stroke or whatever that they didn't like or whatever. It could be. It feels like it's something that could well be just adjacent. Whereas the sort of biopsychosocial model or something like that, especially true holistic care, is what I'm kind of getting at there, rather than narrow pathology-based biomedicalism. You could see me potentially being, I doubt I'd be biting, but like more likely to receive a response from me in a potential defensive way, and that's the sort of difference there that I feel like the professional piece is relevant access, and I'm certainly passionate about trying to blur where possible. But I do think that that's less of an in terms of attachment to taking offence and conversation breakdown. Those modalities, the heuristic identities within. That's a lot. That makes sense. I'm interested in. I really enjoyed some already coming in. That's so from, but in the last 10 minutes, little butchers at what you guys are saying. Really appreciate your thoughts on this. Well, Gerber's interested. That's what I like. The first comment coming in. Coburn said, "Why does it matter?" Yeah, that's the interprofessional thing. I totally agree. As you know, professionally, it clearly matters to some people. That's the thing. You know, whether it is a different question. I suppose that it does. Talking about today, probably more should. Interestingly, that he had got a little pushback from using the term agnosticism with a recent episode of the Words Matters podcast. If you haven't, then please check out the Words Matters podcast by Oliver Thompson. Unbelievable show, really creating a lovely culture, and it's somewhere that I love to listen. I rarely, it's probably one of those that I listen to when as soon as it's sold out within a few days. So please do. Fantastic show. But yeah, interestingly, he's an osteopath, but for someone that typically, I doubt me and him would give a monkeys about the certificate on each other's walls when thinking about those identity-based questions. But he mentioned in a podcast this term, I think it was even in the title of his show that he did with Steve Vogel, which is fantastic. Please listen to it. Talking about professional agnosticism, a brilliant term. And he sounds like he got a little pushback, which I'm interested in. Wonder if he expands a little bit under the comment. But Alistair Beverley has said, "I just use boring old physio, really. I think identifying as one or another, to me, shows you've limited your treatment approaches to whatever reason, which to me wouldn't work for many people I work with." A brilliant example. Alistair works with people with learning disabilities and is a learning disability physio, but fundamentally, he's saying that he wouldn't want to identify with a modality because that might limit the range of scope you'd care for. I think that's one of the reasons why I've found myself never really going that way. Is because why would you limit your option? However, people have seen me be critical of certain modalities or styles or heuristics, as I keep mentioning, like these broader movement paradigms or whatever. And so maybe have seen me, maybe be a hypocrite in that direction. I don't know. Now, Daniel Gerber, he's great to have Daniel listening, because this is a great example of someone that I think he's explaining now. I had to change what I call myself. I went from an osteopath to calling myself an ex-osteopath to rehab, remedial, sports therapist. I'll throw in MSK specialist, hands-on sports massage god. So yeah, Dan's giving a lot of names there, and certainly someone that I've been meaning to catch up with. but also potentially be up for it. I'd love to get you on the show, Dan, especially to talk about some of these things, because Dan's an osteopath that's then we're not an osteopath anymore, but then still works within MSK, and so that's someone that's going to have had various different challenges within his identity, both in terms of what he calls himself publicly, but I wonder how that maps to his style of care, which is of course what matters. Now, Joe Turner's given an example. Hi, Joe. She said MSK therapist with a particular interest in, and that's the thing, that why I'm not inherently against these intra-professional titles is because I can so understand. It's like, and Joe's tuning in on LinkedIn. It's just reminded me of how when you're writing something down, or I'm asked for a bio when I'm asked to speak somewhere, or give me a bio, and you sort of end up sometimes laying something on there, attaching skills or attaching interests or whatever. And I don't have a problem with that because you can understand the context. Again, it's that shorthand. But how much do you where I'm suggesting it sort of becomes problem where it becomes pathological even sometimes is when it becomes so central to your character that you become exposed to challenge of the thing and you feel that personally. So I found that difficult. Intra, it's shorthand for sometimes a brag or taking a position. I'm a physiotherapist. I avoid the drama. Love it. That's brilliant. Cheers, David. Really appreciate it. Titles or labels also virtue signal to fellow group members, like a Mason's handshake. I think that's certainly central to some. I don't think always, and that's what I'm going to be clear on here. And that's not just me trying to find a fence to sit on. It's just more that I can so see circumstances where it's like it just don't matter, and then there's other circumstances where it's definitely that, where it's sort of like, speaking as a ex-therapist, and it's like calling on the tribe to sometimes join the party. So I think that's a great point there, David. Ollie's then commented saying Dave Newell talks about this. Some clinicians cannot separate professional theory or thing from themselves. They embody the dogma. Pretty sure Dave Newell's who Ollie had on the podcast a couple of months back, and again, fantastic show. Please listen to it. Chiropractor by background, from what I recall, or into chiropractic research. What else we got here? I don't think I'm going to be able to get through them all. Thank you so much for all the comments coming in. Absolutely brilliant. I'm really sorry. I will revisit these, of course. Revisit all the questions and comments. Rob Bevan, let's get him up just because it's great to have a Caro on the show. I think the public identify, maybe he's meaning, professions more with specific modalities than us professionals do. I think that's a good point, is that it sometimes doesn't matter, especially interprofessionally. It doesn't necessarily matter as to how you identify, it's how you're identified. And that's relevant because there's sometimes this public education piece about, if we're going to try and blur the lines, that's well and good us doing it between ourselves, but how does that drip through? I think to some extent, not calling each other nasty names in the clinic room walls or the sort of interprofessional slander of yesteryear that can occur will help. But generally speaking, that, and imagine, speaking, I don't want to speak for Rob here, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, but I imagine that people would tend to see Rob as a chiropractor, and before the time they've hung their coat up, they're lying on the couch ready to get snap, crackle, and popped. And you can understand why that might be. It's a perception that many have, and sometimes that, because that stereotype sometimes plays. I don't think Rob would push back and say, I don't know why they would do that, because us chiros don't do that sort of thing. It's like it's sort of why these stereotypes emerge sometimes, because there's many that comply within it. And so we need to then think about how to help people like Rob, and how he can work these blurring these professional lines, but also then trying to drip that through into the public, of course. But again, let's have a look. Bernadette Johnson, not so much their identity or self, but maybe their business model. Can't help but agree with that. I think that's something that's really relevant, is that, and I mentioned at the start, didn't I, that sometimes it's a marketing angle. And something I've called out before is that it's way that people trying to differentiate themselves in a marketing sense. Of course, I'm someone that's into marketing in such a way that, of course, I understand it and I understand its utility. But sometimes it is sometimes playing into a misconception of what MSK care should be. So if you're advertising, and every third sentence is very hands-on. I'm a hands-on this, I'm a hands-on that. Speaking as a manual therapist who's very hands-on with his patients and stuff, and that's all over your web, sometimes all over your website, in part because they think that that's a smart thing for Google Analytics, for Google, like search engine optimization. But sometimes it's because they're really strongly wanting to dissociate themselves from sometimes a movement away into a rehab-based model, of which, of course, I'm critical when people get carried away on that theme and aren't laying hands in appropriate fashion. But it's just more that you can see what's happening there. Like, you can see that people are trying to disassociate in such a way as a marketing angle. And I think that when that starts to fuel behaviors and identities, and it's not just, there's something that cuts a bit deeper, where you're then trying to make sure you wash your hands of it, then that's something I think is a bit of an ugly one, because it only fuels the fire, as if there is this clean dichotomy between hands-on and hands-off care, of which, of course, the integration of those two things is where most sensible people live, and therefore if you find someone that's one or the other of those things, then I'm always deeply suspicious. Again, apologies that I'm not going to be able to get to all these wonderful comments today. We'll get back to them. And also, these things fuel future shows, and it sounds like this is a topic that people are passionate about, including, I see on the comments, people that I'd love to discuss this further with. I think I've talked a lot about the interprofessional stuff in such a way that yeah, as I say, I think maybe my views were accidentally, of course, misrepresented in this instance, and one that I'm more into the fact that actually I can understand the context in which it's fair, but then actually that next step where it really affects conversation, of course, that's where I'm most passionate, is that we need to find ways to have better conversations, and one of the ways that it breaks down is if for one, someone identifies it a certain way, and then the next piece is someone's not recognizing its need, the need to be more careful if you're trying to have a productive conversation. Not careful because you have to, because you inherently need to be there, but more that you can be clumsy in a way that if you've got someone whose mind you want to change, or whose point you want to get across to them, then just the fact that it's unlikely to cut through. If that's your end goal, then you're going to make some hot mistakes in that direction if you're not careful. So thanks so much for tuning in. As I say, I'm sorry I couldn't get through as many other questions as I could. It's my fault for starting a little late, so thanks for forgiving me on that. I'll see you all tomorrow. We've got some cracking shows lined up, including guests, which I'll post on social media as to what the roster is for this week and beyond. But yeah, we'll tune in tomorrow, and we'll do more chewing it over. Ta-ra for now.